Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Catholic Truth Podcast, where we teach and preach the Catholic faith, which comes down to us from Jesus and the apostles over 2,000 years. We want to help you to know your faith, love your faith, and live your faith with purpose and passion, and to be set on fire for Christ and his church. And sometimes on this show, we have guests who are experts in their field, and people who know a lot about the Catholic faith or some aspect of the faith, like philosophy or history or theology. And in this case, we are welcoming to the show today Gary Michuta, who is a professional Catholic apologist and an expert in his field. And he's been on Catholic Answers many times. Many of you may know him. He's been an apologist, really, since the 1990s, and he's written many books, including his famous book, Why Catholic Bibles Are Bigger, showing why the Catholic Church has the true canon of Scripture, and his newest book, which we will be talking about today, Revolt Against Reality. And he's regularly appears. He has his own show, Hands On Apologetics, on Ave Maria Radio, and he runs a YouTube channel called Apocrypha Apocalypse. Say that 3 times fast, which is dedicated to the Old Testament canon and showing why, all the history of why the Catholic Church is correct about the Old Testament canon. So if that's something you've ever had questions on, definitely check out his YouTube channel, all his videos, and check out his book. It has so much information. I don't even know how anyone could argue with it. So anyways, today we're going to be discussing with him about his new book, Revolt Against Reality. So Gary, welcome to the show. We're happy to have you back.
Hey, thanks for having me on. And yeah, we have great guests on my radio show, including a certain Brian Mercier, who's been on, and you're one of my favorite guests because you know an awful lot about a lot of subjects. So I've been looking forward to our interview.
Yeah, me too. Thank you very much. And we are going to be covering a ton today, a lot of different subjects, and we're going to be just so people know, we'll probably do a long video and then we'll break them down into smaller sections on different topics so that you can have the long video if you like that, or you can have the bite-sized editions if you want to watch those and share those more easily with other people. Gary, you just wrote a new book, Revolt Against Reality, and it's fighting the foes of sanity and truth. And I think from the serpent to the state. And I think this is so interesting because we are insane today. Our culture has gone insane. We've lost sanity. We've lost truth. Anything goes. And you have kind of given us a history of where all of that came from. How did it all start? How did we get to the place that we are today? And not just today. The Catholic Church today is not the only time the Catholic Church has been under attack. It's pretty much been under attack since it started. And long before that, since Adam and Eve, the devil hates God, couldn't strike back at God once he was kicked out of heaven. So he did the next best thing in his eyes, which was strike back at God's children. And ever since then, he has tried to take us away from God. And maybe you could just start. I mean, I really liked this book and I really recommend this people. Seriously, like it's not too big, but it's also not small, that it's just an overview. This is a good overview of all the problems, the people, the players, the circumstances, the heresies, everything that has plagued the church for 2,000 years leading up to the problems in the church today. So maybe you could just give the people an overview of this book, kind of what it is, what it's about, and kind of just from beginning to end, just a nutshell overview.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Well, basically, like you said, we live in this crazy, incoherent world. So I wanted to write a book on the deep causes because, we need to figure out how to navigate through these insane waters. So what I did was I back engineered. I started with the things we have today and their immediate causes, and then tried to trace back through history, going back and back to see what are the roots of the current insanity today. Because although it seems like this stuff sprang at us overnight, it's actually been in the works for centuries and under different forms, and kind of like the COVID virus keeps mutating and so on and so forth. So so originally I traced it back to heresies against the incarnation, and ultimately I thought a lot of the errors that we encounter throughout history are there implicitly with the serpent's lie to Adam and Eve. So I I decided, okay, I'm just going to do a history of entire, human history, starting with the garden, and kind of pull out some of the themes of the serpent's lie, and then give a very brief overview up to the incarnation. The incarnation is the moment in human history. It's the great unifying moment where the invisible God becomes visible. Divinity is united to humanity, where material things are affirmed in their goodness, such as the human body. It's where we are all united in Christ, and being united in Christ, we're radically united to each other. And all those things have very big implications about how reality is structured. And so I spent some time on the incarnation, kind of teasing out in all these different areas of, the battlegrounds that ensue later on, like marriage, sacraments, governments, the implications of the intrinsic value of humanity, things like that. And from the incarnation, Ryan, what I do is I show that blinding light sparks all these revolutions of thought that just radically dynamize the West and creates Western civilization. And while you're having that going on, you also have certain elements, even within the church, that shrink back from that blinding light of the incarnation. And those are these Christological heresies that ensue, which attack either the humanity or the divinity of Christ. And basically, I just follow the thread through history. So I show that you can't be, spiritual but not religious. That wouldn't have worked in the early church, right? We would not have civilization today if everybody was like that. So I have a chapter where I say, thank God for organized religion. I also look at Islam. I look at Protestantism, what happens to Protestantism. And again, all of this is back engineered, because one of the things I didn't want to do in the book, Brian, was to make a conspiracy theory, which usually it involves the single cause fallacy. Events are caused usually by a number of different causes. And you can construct any conspiracy theory you want just by picking and choosing which causes. So by back engineering it, what I hoped to do was to identify those main causes that really reverberate throughout history. Okay.
Yeah. And let me just jump in real quick on that, because I was going to say that, this isn't your typical presentation either, people. Some people might be like, oh, I read about the Protestant Reformation, or I know the Protestant Reformation. This whole book is presented in a way you've never heard. It's presented in lights that you've never read. For example, he taught me things that I did not know about Protestantism and its origins of Protestantism, even going back to aspects of Gnosticism and other heresies. I think nominalism, was that one of them?
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm. Nominalism, yep. Which that taught me a lot. I did not know. So Gary actually goes far back and shows the causes that led up to Luther's thinking, the things that influenced him, and not positive sources. And also Calvin. And he also goes through King Henry VIII and shows a lot of, and we're going to get into these later in the show. And we're going to, again, break this off into different parts. We're going to have a whole aspect, a whole show video just on Protestantism. But what I like is that he engineers it backwards so that you can see the causes leading up to these things. And they're all based in fact and not just in, hearsay. Oh, this is what the Protestants did. No evidence, no information, no facts.
Yeah. And it's not an accident that Protestantism tends to be anti-incarnational, anti-sacramental. It tends to be more trying to have this direct contact with God. All those things it's not accidental. It's part of the DNA that Luther inherited from previous thinkers. So thank you for that compliment. That's what I love about it, because it's not, well, I don't like this about Protestantism, so I'm going to write about it. It's like, no, these are things that you can trace before Protestantism and afterwards. And when you trace that trajectory, Brian, you end up where we are today, which is just pure insanity. Yeah.
There's so much I want to just jump into on that, but we'll come back to that. So
I know, I do too.
If you guys haven't checked out, where can they get this book, Gary?
You can get it at catholicanswersshop.catholic.com.
Okay, great. So check out Catholic Answers, everybody, Catholic.com. And check out Kathy and check out Gary's YouTube channel and his other books if you are interested. Let's jump into this show. Let us start talking about, I mean, your book, Revolt Against Reality, has so many chapters and covers so many topics. But one of the biggest threads in the book is the assault by Satan on Jesus Christ himself through the church. So you kind of go down through the ages, and even right after Christianity starts and Jesus is Lord, he's risen from the dead, he's both God and man. And all of a sudden, the devil starts influencing people and movements and groups like Gnostics who deny Jesus's humanity, or Islam, or Arians who deny his divinity. So it's like each, like you said, each denies a different aspect. So why don't we start out in this section talking about those attacks on Christ? Maybe you could talk about what are some of those attacks? I mean, I think we could probably start with Gnosticism and how they attacked his humanity, then Arianism, how they attacked his divinity and tried to deny it, and then Islam as well. It's kind of, more Gnostic. And then also, we'll start with Gnosticism, but maybe just give an overview of these attacks and how that Catholic Church, pretty much throughout history, no Protestants were around, Orthodox weren't really around, how the Catholic Church upheld and protected the divinity of Christ and who Jesus really is throughout humanity. Throughout history.
Yeah, well, let's start, we could draw some threads, pull out some threads from the lie of the serpent. And I think that really fits well with Gnosticism. The serpent's lie to Eve is that, first he questions the law. Did God really tell you that you can't eat of the fruit? And then he fills her in on some secret knowledge, right? Really what's going on is God's holding on you. You think God is goodness itself, and God is wanting to do what's best for you, for your flourishing as human beings, but that's a lie. God is deceiving you. The real truth, the secret knowledge that you don't know, is that God doesn't want you to eat the fruit, because if you eat it, you'll become like him, knowing good and evil. You could determine for yourself what is good and evil, implying that God arbitrarily chooses good and evil. So you can pull that thread out to, right around the time of Christ, where you have pagan thought. And pagans, of course, they believed in multiple gods. They also believed largely that physical stuff was evil. It was bad, because that's where the sensation of pain and passions came from. And it's only the invisible interior self that is good, So when God unites himself to humanity in the incarnation, those who were steeped in this worldview shrank back from this idea that God would actually become flesh, assume our humanity. So they denied his humanity. They said that the Docetists, for example, said that Jesus came in what appeared to be human flesh, but it really wasn't. It was kind of, again, a kind of divine deception, right? He appeared human, although he really wasn't. And that salvation for the Gnostics was that there was revelation given to the rank and file, for the plebs, right, the ordinary Christians, but there was a special secret knowledge that Christ and the apostles handed on to the knowing ones. Okay, so you can see how Gnosticism kind of echoes that lie of the serpent, right, with this secret knowledge for salvation, this idea that God is holding out or deceiving you, this recoiling from the humanity of Christ, that Christ's humanity was only an apparition or some other kind of material. And that has important ramifications for how are we to live, because as you know, Brian, what we believe about God determines what we believe about the intrinsic value of each and every human person, which has implications for how we ought to be governed, right? So for the Gnostics, with this belief system, the body was evil. The only thing that mattered was the soul, the interior soul. Procreation was denied, right? It was bad to propagate human bodies, because these are just entrapped souls. You could go on and on and on. Of course, with the incarnation too, remember Christ, by assuming our human nature, brings about this sacramental economy within Christian thought, that the material world's not only good, but God can produce supernatural good through material things. And so, the Gnostics were not sacramentalists. They didn't have the sacraments. What salvation came through was through knowledge. It was purely invisible interior knowledge of God.
Secret knowledge.
Yeah, exactly.
Just like the devil was offering, right?
Yeah, and you could pull Gnosticism, see that thread all through history, keeps reappearing over and over. And as you well know, today you have New Age thought, right? I mean, it's basically repackaged Gnosticism.
Yeah. It's very interesting. I've always found Gnostics, at least they're consistent, like matter is evil. Therefore, you should not be having sex and getting married and having lots of babies because you don't want to bring more matter into the world. If it's evil, why would you want to make more of it? And so they denied a lot of the things that we as Christians accept. And it's interesting that, it reminds me of what Paul says in the Bible. If Christ didn't actually die on the cross, then you are still in your sins. And that's the problem with, Docetism and Gnosticism and different groups like that, is they don't believe Jesus actually died because he didn't have a real body. It just appeared like he did. And that's very problematic, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and you can see that even in today's revolt, you have less and less people are having children. And I think there was a recent poll asking why. And one of the top reasons was for environmental reasons and things like that. It's again, that kind of Gnosticism that, just us and our physical bodies is something wrong or evil or unnatural or catastrophic. And so if we could just get rid of our bodies, life would be great. But the problem is we are body soul composites. You can't do that. It's totally insane.
It's very Hindu and Buddhist. That's one of the goals of yoga, which is samadhi. It's the 8th and final step of yoga, which is to free yourselves from the confinements of your body and from the confines of this world and to become one with all that is, non-physical. And so it's very interesting how many threads you can find it, throughout the world. Yeah. So we have Gnostics and different people who deny the humanity of Jesus. They say that he wasn't really human. He was more like a ghost or just like a phantom. But then there are other people who deny the divinity of Jesus. And we talked about the Arian heresy in the 4th century. People think there's problems in the Catholic Church today, and there is major ones. But people say, well, look at Vatican II. Look at how the problems that ensued after Vatican II. There were 75 years of crisis and chaos after the Council of Nicaea and dealing with the Arian heresy. I mean, there were probably you could count on one hand how many good bishops were left if they hadn't been killed or exiled or just given up the faith. It was a dark, dark time, and so interesting. Maybe you could talk a little bit about Arius and the Arian controversy and how that attacked Christ and what the church did to deal with it.
Yeah. So, Gnosticism opens the door for Arianism because for the Gnostics and also for pagans, that they had all these smaller gods. Some of the more advanced philosophers believe that there was a supreme God, the one who was unknown and unknowable. Okay. And so the Gnostics came out with these ideas of emanations that, kind of like sparks of God that were less than God kind of appear and downward it goes to the material world. Well, Arianism that opens the door for Arians. And what Arius did was he denied that Christ is co-eternal with the Father. He said there was a time when the Son was not, and that God created Christ ex nihilo out of nothing. And so he can't be consubstantial with the Father. He can't be of the same essence or nature, since Christ is essentially a creature. Okay.
And who's, just before you finish that, who's Arius? Just for our viewers, who is Arius as a person? Was he a layman? Was he a priest?
That's a good question. I believe he was a priest. He may have been a bishop. I'm not quite sure.
Okay. I think he was clergy too. I'm pretty sure he was a priest. And that's interesting that a Catholic priest is, I guess it's happening today too, but, created so much controversy in the church. It's very interesting. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. Continue.
No, that's fine. And so you kind of have the Father who's kind of unknown and unknowable. Yeah, the Son who's kind of a creation of the Father and somewhat little lesser than the Father. And of course, this fits in very well with pagans, and that's why the emperors liked the Arian heresy, because they saw this as a way to get more pagans to become Christian.
Mm,
which is kind of funny. A good friend, I'm sure you know him too, Rod Bennett,
mhm,
wrote a book about the apostasy that wasn't.
mhm,
And he makes a really good point that, yeah, there was an apostasy around the time of Constantine, but it wasn't pagans getting into the church. It was the Arian heresy that was
mhm,
really the apostasy.
mhm,
So that has lots of different ramifications. Arianism, that Christ is somehow lesser than God. He's a creature like us. And again, you could pull that thread throughout history to today. The recent incarnation of that would be the Jehovah's Witnesses, right?
yep.
And other groups as well, that the Son is created. Jehovah God's the only true God, and you also find that also in Christian thought. A lot of megachurch places that they'll downplay Christ's divinity. You turn him into a good friend, but not God himself. So yeah, so that's another. So both sides, the humanity and the divinity of Christ, both come under attack.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And as you rightly said, Jehovah's Witnesses are teaching that today, and many other small cults, not
Mhm.
mainline Christianity. But this can be said ad nauseum throughout
Yeah,
Christian history, one heresy after another. Almost every century, sometimes multiple times a century, there was a new person coming up with a new idea. I have it all right. The church has been wrong for hundreds of years. I mean, it sounds
mhm.
like today, like all the denominations out there. No, we got it right. Everyone else is wrong. But
Yeah,
the reality is they all thought they were right based on this heresy. And the Catholic Church had to combat heresy for centuries and centuries just on the divinity of Christ. That's why if people want to look into St. Augustine, what a just a massive rock in the church. He himself crushed like 3 or 4 heresies and helped crush 2 or 3 more heresies after that. I mean,
yeah,
just Nicaea alone, after they pronounced the divinity of Christ and it seemed like the church was all well and good. A few people denied it, but the whole rest of the church accepted it. And yet it all went to, where it's like
yeah.
out of the blue, Christians were attacked and people started denying the faith. And the emperors were starting to take the side of Arianism and then threatening Christians. And it was
Mhm.
just crazy time that, I mean, I love what Warren H. Carroll in his he has a 6-volume set on the history of the Catholic Church, and in his volume, he makes it sound like the entire Christian church, the whole Catholic Church, is about to die out. It's about to die off. Like there's hardly any good bishops left. There's hardly good clergy left. There's lots of good lay people, but they have no idea what to do or where to go.
Yeah,
And he's like, we don't know what to do. And it makes it seem like it's all going to die out. But then he talks about the rocks that rise up, like St. Athanasius and St. Augustine. And meanwhile, St. Patrick had been evangelizing Ireland and had the repercussions of that and all the missionary work that was done up there. And it all cascaded like a waterfall back into the Roman Empire and converted it all. It's just an amazing story, people. Like if you don't know church history, learn it. It's so interesting. That's why Gary's book here, Revolt from Reality, is so interesting because he talks about these things. So you have one who denies the divinity of Christ. You have one who denies the humanity of Christ. And then you have Islam, which is a
yeah.
whole different essence and problem in itself that kind of pulls from a bunch of different sources. Maybe we can look at Islam real quick and how they attack the divinity, or how they attack Christ in the church in general.
Yeah, yeah. But right before they do that, let me just put a little bow on what we just said.
Sure.
Another thing to notice with both groups, especially Gnosticism, since they're trying to base their unity on something other than the incarnation, they splinter. And so you have all these splinter groups having different ideas, mixtures of ideas,
Mm,
not only with Gnostics and Docetists, but also with the Arians too. You have semi-Arianism, all sorts of different beliefs. And that's another key trait that you find with error. It tends to splinter and divide. And with that in mind, what happens is, I trace the development that Christianity begins to grow. We start doing charitable works on scale. And that includes the desert monks going into the desert. And also in Saudi Arabia, it was also kind of the garbage dump for the empire. If there were groups that were heretical and they were banished from the empire, we sent them to Saudi Arabia. So you have all these heretical groups in Saudi
interesting.
Arabia. And there's a great book, and unfortunately, I can't think of it on the tip of my tongue. It's a fellow here in Michigan, wrote his doctoral dissertation on Islam before Muhammad, where he traces some of these Christological groups that frequented the desert that had strangely familiar to, parallel to Islamic beliefs. So Muhammad doesn't come out of nowhere. I mean, these things were circulating in the desert. So anyway, okay, Islam. Let's talk about Islam. So what happens, and this is really cool, Brian. Let's go in the Wayback Machine a little bit. Okay, let's go to a couple hundred years before Christ. So this is the period covered by the Old Testament Deuterocanon, the Hasmonean period. Okay, the Jews encountered Greek philosophy, and something really interesting happens. You have Greek philosophy, reason, and you have the Jews, revelation, faith, right? And what happens is there's this curious correspondence that happens. It's like reason helps the Jews to articulate faith on a whole different, very clear, precise level that they hadn't before. And also Judaism begins to pull out the truths that were discovered by reason and filter out a lot of the falsehoods, okay? So it's almost like Christmas tree lights, reason and faith meet in this period and the lights go on. It's beautiful, right? And that prepares for the incarnation. That sets the stage for it. Now, let's go to Islam, okay? Islam begins to encounter Greek thought through Aristotle. And unlike the Jews before the time of Christ, it's a train wreck when it gets to Islamic revelation, because Islamic revelation doesn't really fit with rational philosophical thought, at least as far as the pagans took it. And so what happens in Islam, and again, I know I'm oversimplifying because these are, again, the most influential things within Islam that kind of passes the torch of previous heresies, is that Islam becomes divided into two schools of thought. You have, well, for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to say the rational party and the irrational party, okay? The rational party really loved Aristotle and reason. And so they begin to try to use that to understand Islam. And it's very interesting because they come up with some ideas that sound pretty close to Christianity, like that we can know good and evil by looking at nature, through reason alone, we can get a basic morality. That the Quran, it was a created book, so we can understand the Quran through history, studying languages, things like that. The problem is that it was rational and it didn't fit with Islamic revelation. So so there was a reaction from the irrational party. So these were the people who wanted to put revelation above reason. And so these conservative Muslims said, no, you can't know anything about Allah through nature. You know it only through his revelation alone, because Allah is unknown and unknowable. Okay, he's like beyond all this. Not only is he unknown and unknowable, but Allah's will is not constrained by his nature. And that was something the rational party was arguing. They were arguing that that God, acts in conformity with his nature. So a good God acts in goodness, and he doesn't change his mind. And that's why we can know him through nature, through the things he created. But they actually used the word compulsion, which is a no-no. They actually said that Allah is compelled by his nature to act only good. Okay. So the irrational party picks up on that, and they say, no, Allah's nature and his will are two different things. Allah wills whatever he wants. It's unconstrained by his nature. So Allah can change his mind. Allah can call a good thing bad and a bad thing good. And what makes it good or bad is what Allah calls it. Okay. So we can't know him by nature, because nature's whatever Allah wills at this particular moment. And what happens is, like within Islam usually happens, it comes to bearing arms. Whoever has the most force wins, and the irrational party wins over the rational party. And so this becomes kind of mainstream Islamic thought, at least in some major circles. And of course, that has some very big ramifications for Islam. This is why science doesn't take place in Islam. Okay, it's because uh, there's a thought called occasionalism, which is pretty weird. It's this idea that things in themselves don't have their own natural capacities. And so everything is a direct will of God or Allah. And let me just illustrate this. This is an incredible quote I got from Robert Riley's book, The Closing of the Muslim Mind, which is a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. He quotes, I think, an Indian scientist. And the Indian scientist says it's un-Islamic to say when you combine hydrogen with oxygen, you get water. That's un-Islamic. What you should say is when you combine hydrogen and oxygen by Allah's will, it becomes water. So the thought there is whatever Allah's will is, it's not the natural properties of hydrogen and oxygen that produce water. It's sheer will of Allah. So Allah could take hydrogen and oxygen, produce a grapefruit, right? Or a palm tree, or, sand, because Allah wills, And so you have this disconnect between reality and revelation. And like I said, that has ramifications for Islam and its intellectual development over time.
Before you finish your thoughts on that, I really liked that part of your book, and I don't know very few people have ever mentioned this reality, is that, and you do mention it in your book, you go through it, but Islam used to have some of the greatest scientists in the world. They used to have some of the greatest mathematicians and thinkers in the world. And it was right around, if you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was the 12th century, maybe the 11th century, where the irrational party took over. And all of a sudden, thinking and reason and rationality and science and math and everything else just stopped, like a dead halt. And it's so amazing that if you look before the 11th century, you'll see some of the greatest breakthroughs in math and science came from Islam. And then all of a sudden, there's just this stop. There's no more of it. And it's so interesting to see. And that's why when you talk to Islam today, or just Muslims in general, they're so, I've been saying this forever. And, after reading your book and some other books, it makes sense why, but they're so irrational. They don't make sense. They don't even live in reality sometimes. And, I just remember I had a Muslim yelling at me that Jesus wasn't white. And I said, yeah, I know that. He was Middle Eastern, he was Jewish, he was probably brown. And he got all mad at me. He said, Jesus wasn't white. I was like, I just agreed with you on that. And he literally could not even hold a rational conversation. Now, I know it's not like that across the board, but the more you get into Islam the way it should be, it doesn't add up, and the rationality starts to go away.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And many Muslims are now westernized. So
yes, exactly.
To the degree that they're westernized, they certainly have their feet more well-grounded, in reality than say a more traditional, more isolated group, like, for example, in Afghanistan. And I could share stories about, actually our soldiers ran into some really curious stuff, because like the tribes in Afghanistan were totally dumbfounded about these unbelievers, because they would say the supply drops would happen on Wednesday, and it would happen on Wednesday. And that was just mind blowing to them, because it's Allah's will that it happens on Wednesday, and there's other stories too about warriors just shooting their guns without aiming it because Allah guides the bullets.
Or that famous boxer who fell down the stairs and he said, Allah willed it, like whatever Allah wills, good or bad, it happens.
Yeah. And I used to work with Chaldean Catholics in the area. And these are Christian Catholics who emigrated from Iraq. And they're way ahead of us in Islamic apologetics. And they would tell me things about Islam. And I would say, that just doesn't make sense. That's totally... what you're telling me is crazy. It just doesn't make sense. And then I read Robert Riley's book, and then all of a sudden everything clicked. And it's like, oh, this makes perfect sense.
Exactly. But really, before we finish this section, what do Muslims believe about Jesus Christ? And, how does that pull from that string in history?
Yeah, interesting enough, Islam denies that Jesus was crucified, that they believe that Allah put a substitute, either a different person or somehow deceived the people that Christ was actually crucified, but actually Jesus was Isa was taken up into heaven, right? And so you have an element of divine deception there that even, again, it's that scandal of the cross and the incarnation that that they have to shrink back from and just say, no, that can't happen, even though they don't believe Jesus is God. The cross is just too much of a pill to bear. So even in terms of Christ's humanity, you still have some, shrinking back from that and denying the crucifixion.
All while denying his divinity as well, because they don't believe he was God or the Son of God. And in fact, the biggest sin in Islam is shirk, which is to attribute a son to God or anyone on the same level as God. And it's the only unforgivable sin in Islam, as far as I know. So, they are dead set against the fact that Jesus is God, the Son of God, or anything like that. And that's a huge problem. That's why Pope John Paul II said that Islam is not even a religion of salvation. It can't be, because they reject Christ and his cross, the remedy for sin and what he did for us for our salvation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And the reason for rejecting the son is interesting, because I believe it's in the Quran where it says that, Allah has no partner, or, has no son because he has no female partner to have a son, which is very interesting. They lose that ability to think of God through analogy, through the things he has made.
Right.
So when they hear that there's a son, they think of physical begetting, much like the Aryans did. That was their problem too. Yeah, and you could pull it with Mormons. There's, as you know, there's many different parallels between Mormon thought and Islam as well.
There is.
Yeah.
There is. Thank you for that. It's so interesting that, down through the ages, the Catholic Church has persevered in every attack against Jesus Christ. As the Catholic Church at the Council of Nicaea and Constantinople, and down through the ages, the Catholic Church has said, no, this is who Jesus Christ is. He's really true God and true man. He's not God just in a human body. He's not God with a, ghost of a body. He's not, three wills, one will, like all of this stuff. It's like he's the hypostatic union. He's fully God, 100% God, and fully man. He is a divine person by nature. He's the eternal word of God, John 1:1. And in fact, the Bible says he's also the wisdom of God and the power of God. And I love that quote from Pope Dionysius in 252 AD. He's excoriating heretics in the 3rd century who are denying the divinity of Christ and saying, if Jesus is the power of God, and Jesus is the word of God, and Jesus is the wisdom of God, you're saying he's created, then you're saying that God's power was created. He didn't have it from all eternity. His wisdom was created. He didn't have it from all eternity. And even in the 3rd century, this Pope is just like laying the smack down on these heretics and their irrational arguments against Jesus. So constantly, if you read the earliest writings of the church people, if you read the popes down through the ages, if you read the church councils, the Catholic Church for centuries, throughout all of church history, has protected Jesus Christ and our Lord and who he really is, because Jesus came to give us the full truth. And that's what I love about the Catholic Church, is even despite the imperfection of the people, the Catholic Church has protected that truth down through the ages. Would you say that's a good assessment, Gary?
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, the one thing I could never figure out, Brian, was if God didn't have wisdom, how in the world did he know how to make a son?
Or anything.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. No, that's spot on.
Yeah. So people check out Gary's book, Revolt Against Reality, Fighting the Foe of Sanity and Truth from the Serpent to the State. Literally covers so many of the problems down through history. You can find it at Catholic Answers Press, Catholic.com. Let's move on to the next section. A lot of people say, the Dark Ages, were a bad time. The Dark Ages were a time when the Catholic Church really prevented growth. It prevented intellectual stimulation. It prevented education. There was a standstill. I mean, many scholars and historians will reiterate this dusty claim that the Catholic Church prevented learning from 1,000 years. Now, most historians won't. Usually it's just anti-Catholic claims. And there's a difference between history and anti-Catholicism. Anti-Catholicism will say Catholic Church didn't allow growth, they prevented people from learning. They basically ruled in a totalitarian way. And if you didn't agree with them, they killed you. And there was so much bloodshed, and it was just evil from beginning to end. And the Catholic Church did nothing but make the world miserable for over 1,000 years. And thank God for Martin Luther, because he came about and freed us from the shackles of Rome, gave us the Bible. You know, this is kind of the anti-Catholic Protestant narrative that has absolutely not even a nutshell or a grain in reality. And so I love that section in your book where you talked about how organized religion, AKA the Catholic Church, built all of Western civilization. And even during the Dark Ages, yes, there were Dark Ages, but it wasn't because of the Catholic Church. What I love is you present the fact that the Catholic Church was a great light during this dark time and actually helped build up the world. And a lot of the stuff that we have today and that we take for granted is in relation to, it's because the Catholic Church gave it to us and helped build it up down through the centuries. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that part of your book. I really liked it. You know, how did organized religion help save the West?
Yeah, actually, I'll even focus even more. I'd say, you know, organized religion itself, you know, saved the West, because a vague philosophy couldn't do what Christians did during that time period. And by the way, just a footnote, I also traced how that myth came about. The first person I think to speak of it as the Dark Ages was actually a Catholic Cardinal, Baronius. There's a very good historian. He referred to it as dark because there weren't many sources from a particular period, and that got co-opted by Protestant no popery history. But we could talk about that for a couple hours maybe. But okay, so how does organized religion save the West, and particularly the Catholic Church? Because the difference between philosophy and religion is that philosophy philosophy seeks for truth, religion proposes truth. Okay, so when organized religion proposes something as true, it has a kind of divine imperative about it. It says things are this way and they cannot be otherwise. Okay, so it forces the human intellect to consider the world through this particular lens. And in light of what happens in the incarnation, Brian, when the Christian worldview begins to be proposed to the faithful, certain things, errors of the past disappear. For example, the ancients believed in time being in a cycle, an everlasting cycle, that the things we're doing today, guess what, Brian, we're going to do the same podcast in another eon or so, and we'll do it again and again forever and ever. And that has radical implications about whether you can have true human progress in knowledge, the value of our actions, all that stuff. You know, everything is predetermined to happen, so free will is denied. With Christ, he flattens out time. Okay, and so it's proposed that time does not repeat, and imposes it upon the faithful. Another thing too is divine revelation, that God created everything from nothing is proposed. And also this passage in the Book of Wisdom, a deuterocanonical book that Protestants and Jews don't have, where the Book of Wisdom says that God has disposed all things through number, weight, and measure. Okay, that's actually a philosophical principle that the Greeks kind of were hitting at, that, you know, number, weight, and measure are what we call abstractions. They don't exist in the real world as such. Okay, you can't go down to the store and buy a 3. Okay, or you can't buy 12 inches, right? But you can buy 3 eggs or 12 inches of sausage or something, right? But what Revelation does is it says these abstractions that our mind can see, God actually disposes all things so that we could read the language in which creation was made. And those two things, creation ex nihilo, or 3 things, the abstractions idea, and also this idea of flat time, creates in the Christian West what becomes modern science. That's why you have these fantastic discoveries throughout all over the world. You have the Chinese make discoveries, Indians make discoveries, Babylonians make discoveries, Islamic scholars make discoveries, but science never takes roots in these cultures because they didn't have the recipe book, which is the incarnation. that
And
explains
what's
the
the
big picture.
incarnation for our viewers, just in case someone doesn't know?
Yeah, that God assumed human nature to himself. And so we can know God through the things he has made, and God reveals himself through material things. So now Christians have, Christian culture. Therefore, it was important to understand how things are put together, because we are essentially learning God's wisdom by examining the things around us, right? So it becomes a self-sustaining enterprise in the Christian West and nowhere else in the world. And I recommend writings of Father Stanley Yaki, who is a physicist and a theologian. He does a fantastic job going through the history and why this is so, It's also, this is a time where the Roman Empire begins to collapse and the center of power is moved from Rome to Constantinople. And so what happens is there's a huge power vacuum in the West, and a lot of physical suffering occurring. And the only institution left standing to help people get back on their feet is the church. So you have popes like St. Gregory the Great, who steps in and fills the breach. He begins to kind of become a temporal ruler as well as a religious ruler, and get things back on their feet, begin to reorganize society. If that didn't happen, the West would have been set back, centuries, maybe even longer in its development. So, and that's kind of as beautiful as, and again, of philosophy or being, was it
spiritual but not
yeah,
religious?
spiritual and not religious. Yeah, that just wouldn't work, right? You could be spiritual and not religious, and everybody will starve, right?
Yeah.
You have to have the organization, you have to have the structure, you have to have that imperative, right, to help people. And that becomes kind of a two-edged sword, because although the church stepped into the breach, as we find later in history, it's that entanglement with temporal rulership that ultimately starts causing problems in the West as well.
Right. And I think people just don't understand how, what was going on at the time. I mean, at the beginning of the Dark Ages, it was dark. Well, among other reasons, but there was so much war on every side for centuries. I mean, the Roman Empire, which seemed impenetrable, finally just broke, as you said, and barbarians and Vikings and all sorts of barbarian tribes just ransacked the Roman Empire again and again. And there was nothing anyone in that entire area could do. And, so just tons of war, burning of libraries and literature, burning of churches, burning of pretty much everything over and over. I mean, it was dark. And yet, in one of my favorite parts of history is that the Catholic Church is there fixing it all, mending it all, taking as many books as they can, not just Catholic books, but classics that we know today, like Cicero, and recopying them and recopying them and recopying them and making more libraries. And I think it was Thomas Woods who said that sort of like in Greece, there was a blackout period, I think, of 300 years in literacy because of some things that were similar. But they said that same thing probably would have happened in the Roman Empire if it wasn't for the Catholic Church and all the monks copying all that literature and keeping that and preserving the language and written literacy. So I don't think people realize how dark it was at the time. And the Roman Empire and Persia were at war, and they just collapsed each other. And then, enter Islam, who walks over both of those dead empires and just destroys. So as soon as the barbarians and the Vikings are done rampaging for 200 years, walks in Islam, and it's war from beginning to end, taking over the world again. So it's like, wow, like what a time to live in. And yet, maybe you could talk a little bit about, what the Catholic Church did during that time. So maybe some of the inventions, the university, different things like that.
Yeah, boy, so much to cover. The monastic system, this whole system of the monasteries, like you said, part of their charism was to preserve knowledge, and not just religious knowledge, but anything. Even Greek operatic poetry was copied in the libraries at the monasteries, and because they shared information between them, there was a redundancy system. So if the barbarians took out a couple of monasteries, the loss would be minimal because their libraries would have been duplicated in all the other monasteries. Not only that, Brian, but you have technology, as they're learning technology, like how to drain swamps and reclaim land and things like that, they would share it throughout the monastery so that all of them could use the same technology. So in a way, the Dark Ages actually was a mini industrial revolution in some ways. Some people have likened it to that. And also then you have education. Of course, the church always carried on this idea of education in the monasteries, but eventually the Pope, along with the Holy Roman Emperor, begins what becomes the university system. And again, you have that network of the church, that Catholicity of the church. Just like in the monasteries where you have that redundancy system, the Catholicity of the church is used for education, so that you have these cathedral schools that pop up, and the church begins to give degrees, issue degrees, and pontifical degrees would be recognized in all the universities that are basically within the church's realm. So you could have professors going from one university to another, sharing ideas. So you have this intellectual network that's just brimming, and that also becomes the engine of intellectual technological development in the West as well.
But I think it's good to say at this time that most people were not educated before this time. It was the Catholic Church who expanded education, because before that, it was really just for the rich and the wealthy and the noble. And it was the Catholic Church who made it more for the common person and started schools, like you said, charter schools and universities and things like that. And not just, Catholic indoctrination. They had to learn other arguments from other religions, and they had to study them and understand them, and they had to read secular works and math and science. And so I think it's said that if it wasn't for this mini revolution of the monks and the university systems and everything that the Catholic Church did for over 1,000 years to help expand education, we probably would not have had the actual scientific revolution that we had modern day. Because, where did that come from? Out of the blue? No, it had been built over 1,000 years through the church.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, with my book, I'm always pulling threads of thoughts. Once you get through the religious wars, the Protestant wars and stuff, you start having secular education, which is very different. Before education was unified, what we were trying to do is understand all areas of knowledge and how they relate to one another, right? When you start having secular universities that begin to pop up, what happens is, and this is another thing we'll talk about when we talk about nominalism, is things become specialized and departmentalized. So before, you would learn theology, philosophy, natural science, logic, all that stuff, and it all be unified. Now in the secular universities, we start having religion becomes an add-on class among many add-on classes. Then you continue to pull that revolution of thought, or de-evolution of thought, to today, where everything is so specialized, right? There's an awesome saying, I forgot who says it, but he says we're learning more and more about less and less. So basically, people who know everything about nothing. It's like education becomes atomized, because we're no longer seeing that, again, through the lens of the incarnation, that great unifying moment in human history. Once that's rejected, then human knowledge becomes disassociated and pulled apart.
Sounds like the Enlightenment era. Learn a lot about nothing, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Before we finish this, I just want to say to people too, that one thing I just find fascinating about this, time period, is that the Catholic Church invented a lot of things we take for granted, like economics, law. They copied the Bible for over 1,000 years so that we could have the Bible and translated it into different languages. The Catholic Church, I think, has 35 craters on the moon named after Catholic priests because of the extraordinary mathematical and scientific achievements that they had during the Dark Ages, during the Middle Ages. And so it's just amazing. Anyone could go to even something like Wikipedia and just look up Catholic scientist priests, and you'll scroll and scroll and scroll. So many of these were during the Middle Ages, during the Dark Ages. And a lot of what we have today is because of that. And I definitely highly recommend Gary's book, Revolt Against Reality. He goes through all of this, and he gives the history, and he shows how one thing leads to the next, to the next. Every group in history kind of relied on a previous inspiration of good or bad. And if you didn't keep the truth that Jesus Christ gave us and you started saying, well, I think this, and then someone else gets influenced by that and changes it a little, but then someone else gets influenced by both of those and changes it a little more and becomes all of a sudden we have thousands and tens of thousands of different competing philosophies and religions and denominations and everything else. And it's just so interesting. If you want a good, summed up history on all of this, people, Revolt Against Reality can be found on Catholic Answers, Catholic.com in their shop. So, thank you for talking about this section, Gary.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's amazing sections for sure.
Yeah, I love it all. I just loved your whole book, to be honest. So why don't we move on to, one of my favorite sections in your book, Revolt Against Reality, was on Protestantism. It's so interesting that most people just present Protestants as Protestants. Oh, Martin Luther just discovered faith alone. Oh, he just discovered, the things he believed from the Bible. But in reality, he was actually influenced himself by other people before him who were influenced by people before him. And you do this amazing artist, I don't know how to say it, it's a master artist kind of a job where you trace the weaving of all these different philosophies back to nominalism and Gnosticism and different things like that. And you show in point of fact, not just hearsay or theory, of how the Protestant reformers relied on these other philosophies and on these other thoughts that were not from Christ or departed from Christ. Yes, in part, they accepted a lot of things from Jesus and the church and the Bible, but in other ways, they were influenced by things that had departed from true Christianity. So maybe you can talk about Martin Luther, his problematic theology, and the people that influenced him.
Okay. Yeah. Let me just really quick, I'll pull that thread through.
And maybe nominalism too, just for our viewers, maybe what nominalism is. Maybe you could start there.
Yeah. I think that would probably help fill out a little bit. We talked about Islam and what happened when reason and revelation for Islam collided. And so you had this party that separated God's nature from his will, right? And that was one way of dealing with it. Well, that same thought gets adopted in the West during a controversy with Ludwig of Bavaria and Pope John the 22nd. So this is in the 1300s. Okay. And basically, I could go through the whole background. It's fascinating, but I'll skip over it. Basically, there's a war that ensues between the civil ruler, Ludwig of Bavaria, and the Pope. And Ludwig of Bavaria does the scorched earth policy where he goes after the Pope with the force of arms. He actually, by force makes himself, elected emperor, and also through intellect. And he one of the two main people he employs is a person named William of Ockham, who's a Franciscan friar. And William of Ockham was kind of in hot water. At this time, the University of Paris imbibed a lot of Aristotle, and the church was trying to baptize Aristotle just because Aristotle's a pagan. So there's errors in his philosophy. You can't adapt it wholeheartedly, everything he wrote as a Christian. So
just
anyway,
for our viewers, just in case that's a confusing statement, by baptizing Aristotle, they mean taking the parts that are true and keeping those and discarding the rest so that people can know what is true and what's not, just not baptizing. Okay, he's a Catholic now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you for saying that. So, okay. So at this time, the Franciscan order, there was these poor Franciscans that had run into problems because they were saying that absolute poverty was essentially the best expression of the gospel. And so they were in Avignon. This was during the Avignon papacy. They were going to be brought before the papal court. They needed to argue the case. Just so happens William of Ockham was there, so he was enlisted to argue their case. And basically the church said that this is false because we know in the Old Testament, God sees good material goods as goods, right? The good creation. In fact, he legislates property and goods under the Mosaic law. And Jesus, they owned at least one sword. They had a money purse. They were not absolutely, impoverished. And so Occam's solution was interesting. He said, well, God could change his mind. He could say that property is good in the Old Testament and then say property is evil in the New Testament. What really matters is what kind of name God puts on certain things, not necessarily what they are in their essence or intrinsically. Now, for those who
Sounds
have
like
listened,
Islam, doesn't it?
yeah,
God can
I
change
was
his
going to
mind.
say, yeah. So this sounds a lot like what we talked about with Islam, right? Because Allah can change his mind. It doesn't matter if something's good or right or wrong. It's his will that's primary. Well, anyway, William of Ockham escapes from the papal court before a decision is made into the loving arms of Ludwig of Bavaria. And so he starts this philosophical campaign, which essentially, again, argues it detaches God's will from his nature. That's called voluntarism, because it's God's will is just purely arbitrary. He also denies this idea of universals. We talked a little bit about abstractions, universals. He said they don't really exist. What exists really is just particular individual things. So that's a little heady, but it's important. And so what happens with Ockhamism is it becomes slowly the new way, the modern way. In fact, it's called nominalism, nameism, if you will. And that becomes
and stick
the
with us,
predominant.
people. Like, this is so interesting. This literally leads to the Protestant Reformation. Like, you have to understand this. I just want to reaffirm that. So we have nominalism.
Right. Yeah. And Occam said that, God could have crucified a donkey and it would have sufficed to save the world's its sins.
Heresy.
Because it doesn't matter what's crucified. What matters is what Allah, or not what Allah, but what God says. See, I'm just getting those disconnect. But anyway, so whatever God calls it, if he says, hey, that's sufficient for the sins of the world, then it's sufficient. It doesn't matter what actually happens in reality. So this becomes the modern way. So modernism, we think of it as a new thing. This is like old time modernism, as opposed to the Via Antiqua, the ancient way, which was anchored in St. Thomas Aquinas. And then Martin Luther comes onto the scene, and he grew up and he was well soaked in this nominalistic philosophy. Now, he didn't accept everything the nominalists taught, because some of their things they taught were kind of plagiarized, but he did imbibe a lot from them. And so all you have to do is take Occam's thought and look at Martin Luther and what he says about, say, justification. And it's not hard to see the similarity there, because Martin Luther says that basically we are decreed by God to be righteous, even though intrinsically what we actually are unrighteous, damn-worthy sinners. But we're called righteous, and that declaration that God puts on us, this name, if you will, of righteousness, is what justifies us, that which makes us right with God.
So whatever God says is like the donkey.
Yeah, exactly. So we're donkeys. God says, for the sake of Christ, I declare you righteous, and we're righteous, even though we're still donkeys. So basically, he takes nominalism and he applies it to theology. And this has huge ramifications, right? Just like in Islam becomes a religion of the book. The only way to know Allah's will is through the Quran and through the Hadiths, Muhammad's revelations. With Luther, it becomes sola scriptura. The only way to know God's will is what he says in Scripture, what he decrees in Scripture.
Through the book.
And in Islam, the only way you understand the book is through clerics. In Protestantism, the only way you understand is through, this, for Luther, it'd be the ministers who interpret it correctly, right? Of course, that changes later on. And so another thing, Islam denies free will, right? Everything is Allah's will. Guess what happens with Luther? Denies free will. The parallels aren't there by accident.
Calvin did too, didn't he?
It's the same line of thought. Yeah, actually. And Calvin kind of takes Luther's theology and makes it more consistent, logically consistent. And then so you have this, and then again, you have this fracturing that occurs. You have a little bit of that in Islam. With Martin Luther, he kind of sows the seed for the fracturing that then occurs. And this is an important juncture in my book. I believe, and I actually got this from a Lutheran source that kind of tipped me off to this. Protestant identity, Brian, is anchored by two principles. The first one is the righteous rebel. Okay. Why did Martin Luther reject the historic church? Because his cause was just. He was right. Okay. And his private conscience allowed him to reject the historic church. The second thing is doctrinal purity. Why did he reject the historic church? Because he wanted to purify its doctrines. Okay. Those two principles become part of Protestant identity. You know, the apocryphal words of Luther at the Diet of Worms, you know, here I stand, I could do no other. You know, you had the righteous rebel, and then again, you know, sola scriptura, sola fide, all those solas, you know, purity of doctrine. Well, what happens is that becomes part of the Protestant DNA. And so what happens is, if Martin Luther could be the righteous rebel for doctrinal purity and he could split from the historic church, then I, as a Protestant, can be a righteous rebel against Luther if I don't believe that he's teaching pure doctrine. And so those two principles just start shattering Protestantism, like into all sorts of different groups, sects, until I don't have the exact quote, but I think it's like maybe 50 years after Luther, there was a book that was written about 200 different interpretations of "This is my body."
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it really, everything just becomes individualized or atomized within this kind of nominalistic theology.
Yeah, I agree with you. One of the most amazing things in your book is that you actually quote lots of quotes from Luther himself and quotes from Occam, quotes from Islam, and you show parallels of the very similar teachings, even from Huss and even
Yeah.
earlier influences of Luther, where he got his stuff from, and they got theirs from other nominalistic sources. But you have a lot of quotes from Luther. You have quotes from Calvin. You have quotes from everywhere. It's not just hearsay or this is what we believe. You know, they're all well documented in his theology. I mean, Luther has a lot of writings. And as you said, he was all over the place, contradicted himself constantly. You know, like it was up one day, down one day. And Calvin tried to take that mess and synthesize it into like something organized and, you know, reasonable, rational. So I really like what you did in showing the nominalism, how it kind of went down through Willem of Ockham, and how he kind of influenced the church in where? Bavaria. And
Yeah.
where exactly is that?
Yeah, it's in Germany. Yeah.
Oh, in Germany.
Yeah.
Right where Luther started and where it kind of spread, because he had the ear of the emperor. And so that whole philosophy kind of started spreading. So from the beginning, the Catholic Church rejected this nominalism. It rejected this heresy. But through the emperor in Germany, it kind of soaked it in, per se. I guess that's what I kind of got out of your book. And it influenced a lot of people, including Luther. Maybe you could talk about, you just touched on it, but maybe you could briefly talk about maybe restorationism is the right word. Basically how Luther claimed to have the truth. But I actually wrote this down in your book somewhere on one of the pages in the margins. I said, oh, well, you know, Luther had the pure doctrine, you know, pure doctrinal purity. But then Calvin's like, you didn't get it quite right. You got it mostly right, but not quite right. Then Zwingli's like, well, you guys both have a lot of truth, but you missed by a little bit. And the Anabaptists like, actually, you guys are off just on this one part, you know, on infant baptism. And the other was like, no, you got it. So everyone thinks they alone have the doctrinal purity. And it's like, but you didn't get it quite right. So we got it right. Now add 1,000 denominations. Now add 10,000 denominations. And I just found that part of your book, like that was very interesting that they all claim to be. And then you have the restorationist movements, which you're all wrong. We have original Christianity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you just pull that thread all the way through. Yeah, actually, what happens with Protestantism, again, this is where the temporal and spiritual orders are pretty much interlocked, right? That's how it was throughout human history. So when Protestantism begins to break up the faith, what happens is you start having civil wars, you know, and you have Catholics against Protestants, Protestants against Protestants, and, you know, all this armed warfare over, like you said, individual doctrines, right? And so what happens is people are saying, look, we can't survive with all this constant bickering and fighting, you know, one country against another. So we need to find some way to unify, right? How are we going to put this all together so we can all live peacefully? And that opens up a whole new can of worms with the Enlightenment, deism, this idea that Christianity is really nothing but propositions. And so if we just limit the number of propositions you have to hold, then we could unify all Christians. In fact, we can unify the whole world, if we make it simple enough. Another thing too is that, religion suddenly becomes interior, right? It's no longer interior and exterior, faith and works. Now religion is really just the convictions I hold in my soul about what Jesus did for me, right?
Subjective.
Martin Luther's reflexive faith that Martin Luther puts in, right? So that opens the door for people like John Locke to come up with this idea of, we can have church and state, and we can separate the two. And, so you can play with all your doctrines and propositions in this little safe zone over here. Well, the state is concerned with the real life issues of property, liberty, life, things like that. And of course, that again, like you pointed out, every time we try to come up with a solution apart from the incarnation, it just makes a bigger problem. And what Locke didn't realize was all those things he listed as part of the state, right, is actually religious philosophical questions like life, right? What is life? What's the value of life? When does life begin, right? Those questions aren't determined by state, by a vote. Those are determined by philosophy and religion, reason and theology, basically, right?
Yeah, before you get back to that, maybe we can back up just a little bit, if you don't mind, because I really like the connection that you made. Like you're talking about, it should be religion. It should be based in Christ. But with Protestantism, it kind of becomes based on my interpretation of what I think the Bible's saying. And it's really almost subjective interpretation based on my opinions, what I think the Holy Spirit's saying. But so many people came up with so many contradicting thoughts. And it even created a lot of problems for the Protestants themselves in their subjective thinking. And one of the parts I found interesting in your book was that their subjective thinking led to later on subjective thinking. I almost think like the moral relativism we have today, which plagues our society, almost started with, later Protestants. We all believe in Jesus. So as long as you believe in Jesus, it's okay. It doesn't matter what you believe. Whoa. Well, Mormons believe in Jesus. It really does matter. Islam believes in Jesus. It does matter what you believe outside of that. So
within Protestantism, there's this, and this is part, I think, of Ockhamism as well. It's that philosophy of nominalism. It tends to be reductionistic. It tends to try to reduce things to the more simpler order. So Martin Luther's understanding of the church is much higher than evangelicals today, right? Or even Lutherans in some ways. But, as it's fracturing and you're trying to find some way to unify apart from Christ incarnation, because Christ is both head and body. The church is the incarnation, the extension of the incarnation throughout history. To try to find unity apart from that, the best one path that is used is this reductionism, where, some things are more peripheral than others. We'll just agree on the core values. We can disagree on the things that aren't core. And then you start disagreeing about what's core and what's not core. And then what happens is you have, religion now becomes purely interior, right? That's what unites us, is our interior belief, this conversionism that erupts in America during the Second Great Awakening, which spawns Mormonism, Restoration movement, all that stuff, New Age thought. It's like, we could just reduce it down to our beliefs, and the exterior stuff actually becomes an impediment. So it doesn't matter what church you belong to, as long as you have this interior conviction that you've been saved and Jesus died for your sins. So if you follow that thread, what happens is, this interior religion, that all that matters is our interior beliefs. The exterior things like church membership is optional. It doesn't really matter. You keep pulling it, you get to non-denominationalism. What I call the lowest common denomination, right? You just start shredding this. It doesn't matter whether you're Baptist, Lutheran, whatever. What matters is if you love Jesus. Brings you to the mega church movement, right? Which basically is a ton of people who gather, who believe on very little other than something about Jesus, and that's pretty vague. You just continue till you get to the non-affiliated, which I think largely is comprised of non-denominational people that just want to go it alone, the spiritual but not religious folk. All of this is part of getting rid of that exterior humanity of the church, that tangible, visible society, and reducing it down to, what's inside my heart, my own beliefs. And again, Brian, this brings us back to Gnosticism that we talked at the beginning. You end up with a kind of Gnostic worldview that it's not your body that's saved, it's saving your soul. And how do you save your soul? By special divine knowledge, secret knowledge that you can only know.
So interesting. And as you said and hinted at, that leads to Mormonism and the Church of God and the Church of Christ and a countless other of restoration movements where it's not just like we disagree with a few of your principles. You're all wrong. Only we're right. Jesus Christ started our church. He restored the church with Mormons, or he restored the church with Jehovah's Witness. One of the Mormon claims is all religions are evil and wrong, and Jesus started our religion. But then the Church of Christ says the same thing. Church of God says the same thing. You just see it's across the board. It's so confusing. It's all over the place. And it's really sad how Martin Luther and Calvin and King Henry VIII even, and you have a whole section of him in your book, which was very interesting, and how it just divided, destroyed, and brought asunder Christianity, really brought schism, and then schism upon schism and schism upon schism upon schism into the body of Christ. And it's something that Christ never wanted, because he wanted one faith, one hope, one baptism, one church, one doctrine. And I think you do a great job in your book. And we don't have time to talk about it today, but you talk about the smear campaigns that Protestants have about Bloody Mary and a lot of the false myths that Protestants have brought up and just repeated for centuries, when there's actual historical facts that debunk them. So if you're interested in all of this, and this sounds good to you, our viewers, check out Gary's new book, Revolt Against Reality, from Catholic Answers Press, Catholic.com. It's an excellent book. We only have about 15 minutes left, but I may put this section together with the last one, but I may do it as a separate one. But maybe you could talk about how the Protestant Reformation, you had started hinting at it in this last section, but how it led to the John Locke and eventually the Enlightenment era and all of the hordes of problems that we have today.
Yeah. Well, it was, like I said, when we first began, what you believe in God will determine what you believe about the intrinsic value of human life, which will determine how we ought to be governed, right? So they're all interconnected. So with Luther's nominalistic God, it kind of splits reality into the exterior, interior, visible, invisible. It kind of separates a lot of those things that the incarnation wedded. One of those things is he came up with the two kingdom understanding, that there's the kingdom of God and then the kingdom of the state, and they both have different aspects to them. And they're kind of separate, two distinct spheres. And so what happens is that sows the seed for this understanding of the invention of religion, which I get into my book, which is a mind-blowing concept. But, religion as a separate part of society didn't exist in ancient times. That's a modern invention. Before religions, religio was a virtue under the heading of justice. And it's just basically any duty is a religious duty. So voting, would be a religious duty just as much as going to church is religious. What happens in the Enlightenment is they take that two kingdom idea, and John Locke then separates the two, and he invents this idea of religion versus the state. And so there are some things that are in the religious sphere. It's all internal, interior, theological propositions, a kind of safe space so you could play your religious stuff. And then there's the rest of society with life, liberty, property, things like that, which he says is not religious. And of course, this is entirely artificial, and it's used by liberal politics, to kind of neutralize the church's influence in the secular sphere, so to speak. because
So we almost use it as a weapon against the church to kind of keep, we don't like your thoughts, we don't like your philosophy. So basically to keep the thoughts at bay.
yeah, and it's totally artificial. Like I said, life, liberty, property, all that stuff. That's religious. How do you determine those type of things? What is life? When does life begin? What is the value of human life? The state has no competency to determine that, and so what it did was kind of pulled certain aspects that were under religious control and now detached it from the church. Okay. And what happens is the state just keeps encroaching more and more, pushing religion into a corner and engaging in things that were completely religious before now become the part of the state. And I go into all sorts of things like supernatural charity, which morphs into the monastery system, which morphs into hospitals, right? With that revolutions of thought from the incarnation. Then you have the poor laws, right? Once Henry VIII suppresses the monasteries in England, now we have poor that no one could care for them. So now he starts taxing churches and taking the money from the taxes to pay for taking care of the poor. The poor laws morph into welfare state, which we're at today, where the state takes care of all this stuff. This was, we didn't have welfare back in the Middle Ages because if you were poor, you'd go to the monasteries and they'd help you. It keeps co-opting all this power with this artificial distinction between the two. So I mean, boy, there's so much to go. The other thing too, the organized religion, the church acted as a cap to the authority of the state. Okay. And this has always been a part of friction, but it was important because with Christianity, it taught rulers that they can't do whatever they want to their citizens. Their powers were limited by God's law. Okay. And if they stray from that, the Pope could, do everything up to the interdict, which would forbid sacraments within a certain area and stuff like that. But it was a capping authority. So what happens with Locke and from the French Revolution onward is that capping authority is effectively removed. And that incidentally, brings us to the turn of the 1900s, where you have these totalistic atheistic states, right? Because if God doesn't exist, there is no right, wrong, moral law, then whatever's best for the state becomes the determining factor. So you have the rise of, neo-paganism with the Nazis, you have Soviet Union, you have communist China, you have Pol Pot's Cambodia, you have Havana, Cuba, even Mexico. I mean, you had this Cristeros, right? That was the same. Once the church stops being a capping authority, the state can do whatever it can as long as it can get away with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. Hey, can you talk real briefly about how basically the all-out assault of the Enlightenment era, the French Revolution, real briefly, and how that led to really an all-out attack on the church, and then maybe our modern problems today, Vatican II and sexual revolution, and that kind of all stems, just all shows in themselves, but maybe they all flow from one to the next, don't they?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in fact, the closer you get to today, the more dense it becomes. So you start seeing where things begin to blur into other things. And actually, I wish we had 15 hours to go through all of that.
I do too.
But and really, I'm not confident to do that. So
no, that's okay. Revolt Against Reality. It's fighting the foes of sanity and truth, from the serpent to the state. And what I like about that book is it does take the Enlightenment, or like just assaults the church, basically tries to destroy all authority of the church. And you go through quite a bit in your book about how they attack the authority, even in the force of arms, just want to kill and destroy the church at all costs. It almost reminds me of the emperors trying to wipe out Christianity at the beginning of the church. And it exalts scientism and the human mind, and what I say goes, and rationality and not faith. We don't need faith. Faith is outdated and superstitious. What we need is rational thinking. And This leads to all our enlightened philosophers who come up with their own beliefs and ideas, which lead to even in the church, people thinking, well, if maybe the church is wrong, maybe it's not as enlightened as it thinks it is. And you talk about Vatican II and how many people misunderstood Vatican II and started thinking about their own things. And around that time, the sexual revolution. I mean, there's just so much on every side since the beginning of the church that has attacked the church. And to me, that just shows that it's the true church of Jesus, because it's always been attacked. And yet Jesus said the gates of hell won't prevail against it. That's why he said he's going to be there from the beginning of time till the end of time, guiding and guarding his church and sending his Holy Spirit to guide it into all truth. And in an insane world, and I think you paint this perfectly in your book about how from the beginning, the serpent tried to attack Adam and Eve, and then his children, and then Israel, and then the church. I mean, it's literally one after another, after even Jesus Christ over and over, they try to attack his divinity and his humanity, as we've discussed. And yet the church has been there all this time, being guided and guarded by God. Even Israel before the church was guided and guarded by God to keep the truth. And that was preserved at the time of the Messiah through the Catholic Church until today. I don't know if you had any kind of thoughts on all this, but, I would really recommend people's book, Gary's book, Revolt Against Reality. It has so much. You just can't even cover it in a 5-hour show. It's so good.
Yeah. Well, hey, thank you so much. Yeah. Well, I have a very unusual take on Vatican II. I think what Vatican II accidentally did was it knocked the chair out of Protestant identity. And that was already being eroded for quite some time up to that point. But that, I think, was the straw that broke the camel's back. In that, remember, the righteous rebel versus doctrinal purity, right? Those are the two components of Protestant identity. And what happened with Vatican II was you didn't have an imperial pope. You had Pope Paul VI, anything but an imperial pope. You have an ecumenical council with no anathemas. It's talking about ecumenism. Suddenly, the righteous rebel is without a cause. It's pretty hard to argue against Vatican II. The great foe has vanished. And what I think happens in the 60s, and it's very complex, but what I think happens is those pillars of Protestant identity gets transformed into the secular sphere. So now you have the righteous rebel, but instead of doctrinal purity, you have social purity. And what it does is the same thing it did in Protestantism, where in the secular area, it starts atomizing society into individuals and groups. And, society becomes interior dispositions. I have, the mystery of life, little speech that the Supreme Court gave about, everybody makes their own universe about what is liberty and all this other stuff. It becomes atomized to the point where now today, each individual, it's almost like we're living in our own bubble universe where I can use, and again, this is like nominalism. I can call myself whatever I want, and that is me. That's my identity. So I'm a male, but I can call myself female, and I could be a female. So you have to recognize me as a female, or as a walrus, or as a panda, or as something else, right? It's again, it's the superiority of the will over reality, over nature, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So interesting.
Yeah, and so you have that splintering, and I get into it in the book. It really is. It was a hard chapter to write because it's hard to trace insane thoughts, right? But there is a thread that links all these things. And so anyway, Brian, what happened was I ended with I think it was chapter 13. Yeah, chapter 13. And it was so bleak, right? It was such a bleak end because now here's a spoiler alert. So plug your ears if you're going to read the book. But if you're not, the spoiler alert is at the end, we ultimately end up with Adam and the animals again. There's this epidemic of loneliness that has occurred. Remember in the garden, God said it's not good for man to be alone. So in a way, we're kind of finding ourselves back in the garden, but not in a good way. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to add a chapter and I'm going to look at areas where reality is pushing back, because you can deny reality, you can sweep it under the rug, but in the end, reality is real and it's there. right?
Mhm.
So this was a couple years ago. It took a long time to develop this and get this into print. And so I picked out some things that I thought were signs of hope in that last chapter. I call it Reality Strikes Back, my little hat tip to Star Wars.
Mhm.
Um, and what I have to say is what's really cool is now that the book's in print, I've noticed that some of the things that I identified in this chapter has actually grown and become even greater lights of hope. So ultimately, I think that is, a good news for us. Ultimately, that if we're rooted in Christ, both head and body, both Christ and his church, we are anchored to reality. And quite frankly, Brian, there's nothing outside of reality, right? There's
Right.
the real and there's nothing. So
Falsehood.
ultimately, we will persevere and sustain ourselves. Why? Because God is the author of reality.
Yeah, and I think you did a masterful job in your book bringing that full circle, starting with Adam in the garden and bringing us back to today. We're thinking as animals, acting as animals, indulging our animalistic instincts. God created us on the same day as the animals, day 6, but he created us for day 7 to be in worship of him, in relationship with him. And once you reject that, you go back to being an animal again, and it
Yeah.
becomes survival of the fittest. And, there's no right and wrong. There's no good and evil. And that is the atheistic position. There's no free will, which is very similar to Islam in a lot of ways and Gnosticism in a lot of ways. And a lot of the threads that you've pulled through history when we arrive today, and you talk about tons, no fault divorce and sexual perversions of all kinds and everything that we're dealing with in our culture today. You trace back and show how it came from the Enlightenment, which came from Protestantism, which came from nominalism, which came from Gnosticism, and kind
Right.
of all the way back
Yeah.
to the beginning. And I think you do a great job. So people, if you haven't yet and you're really interested in checking out Gary's book, it's called Revolt Against Reality: Fighting the Foes of Sanity and Truth, all the way from the serpent to the state. So from the beginning to what we have now. And it's a great manual of history and what is going on and what has happened in the church and how the church has protected reality despite insanity, and how we are experiencing many of the problems we're experiencing today. But yet, despite even insanity in the church, Jesus still guides his church and protects it and guides it into all truth by the Holy Spirit. So I think it's a great book, and I want to recommend it to people. Revolt Against Reality. You can find it at Catholic Answers Press, catholic.com / shop. And if you're interested, check it out there. Thank you for joining us today, Gary. We could have done this for 5 hours, and I
Yeah.
feel like there was just so much information and so good. And I think it's so informative, and I think people need to do that. So thank you for writing this book and informing us all on this. And thank you for sharing it on our show today.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me on. Hey, I'm honored that you asked me to come on and share this stuff. So kudos to
Yeah.
you.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for tuning in for all of our podcasts and our YouTube videos. Thank you for being informed in your faith. We need Catholics to rise up. We've been lazy for too long. We've been sitting for too long. Our culture and the people who hate the church and God have told us to shut up for too long, and we've listened to them for too long. And it's about time we start standing up, fighting back, and taking back what Jesus Christ gave us, taking the sword, spiritual sword in hand. And so thank you for informing yourselves and, getting this knowledge that comes from God and not from some secret knowledge that we think is in our own head. And thank you for supporting Catholic Truth, everyone. If you would like to see more of what Gary does, check out his YouTube channel, Apocrypha. And
Apocalypse.
Apocrypha Apocalypse. Thank you. And if you would like to find out more of what we do, check out our website at thecatholictruth.org and follow us on our new TikTok and Facebook and Instagram and everything else below. God bless you all. Thank you, Gary.
Awesome. Well, hey, thank you.